welcome to the webinar. Our webinar series is entitled Sport, Leadership and Social Change, and this episode is our 6th episode, Fostering Diversity and Inclusion in and through sport. And welcome. Great to see some familiar names. Really appreciate good buddies showing up to support and just such a wide range of people from across the country. We have just such an amazing panel that is here to discuss the topic, and I'll introduce them shortly. I'm first going to introduce a little bit more about our location and our university programs, etc., but also the webinar series as a whole. We always start by acknowledging and thanking the Lekwungen and Quistupsin people on whose lands our campus resides, also known as Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations communities, for allowing us to live, work, and play and learn and teach on their lands. We give thanks to the ancestors, the supernatural ones, hereditary leaders, matriarchs, and creatures in small,
videos off.
for looking after the rich resources and cultural teachings of this beautiful land. I always draw a parallel to where I'm located. I'm actually not on the campus right now because of COVID, and I operate out of my home office in Cadbro Bay, Victoria. And it's so similar. I have a lovely bay near my house that I can walk to, lovely pathways like Mystic Vale that are completely reflective of the paths that I walk down to get to my office or any other building on campus. We are on 300 hectares on rural roads, and we have the Esquimalt. And 1 second, there we go. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. I can see you, Steph. You hear me all right? Okay, cool. I just had a little bit of a muting action going on. And this is the lake I row on every day. So I used to coach kids out at rural roads on that lagoon, and I now row and coach out on Elk Lake. And it just reminds me how important it is to always acknowledge the water that we're on and we're operating on as well, and our history. At Rural Roads, we try our best to really appreciate and acknowledge both our history. It's really embodied in our logo of that digitized castle. Recognize the impact of colonization and be thankful and grateful that we are actually operating on unceded territories, and do our best to reconcile and repair some of the damage that's been done in our history. We also try to acknowledge the land we operate on because it's teaching us so much. Literally, this is the forest we look out on from our classroom windows. And it embodies so many of the principles that we try to teach at Rural Roads that are the basis for positive social change. Systems thinking being one of them, and really appreciating the diversity that is crucial to a functioning ecosystem. We also partner with a number of organizations. Literally weekly, all of our programs will partner with live organizations for live cases, they're called, where we bring organizations into the classrooms with real-time problems, challenges that they're trying to solve, and we apply our various lenses, communication, business, education, technology, etc., to try to help them navigate those challenges. We also partner with Game Plan, which is an organization, a federal organization that is designed to help athletes move through their sport career and transition into their professional careers. Sometimes they're still sport, but to help them recognize what they're learning from sport and through sport and apply those, bring those to their communities and their professional careers. This is Andrea Burke, a former student of mine who did her MA with our university. I also like to highlight some of the artifacts around the university that embody these principles that I think are really relevant to the conversation today. And one of them is this idea of a bridge. It is our metaphor for our School of Communication and Culture. A bridge can only be built after you mind the gap, right? Once you understand the differences, the two sides, or the different points that you're trying to unite or connect, can you then build an actual bridge, whether that be a relationship or a handshake or an actual structural bridge of this nature. You need to understand both sides of the lake or the river or the divide, and be really conscious of the differences between those that you're trying to relate to. And that is the underlying foundation of communication and culture. Super relevant to today's conversation about sport leadership and social change, and in particular in our effort to address how to be more diverse and inclusive within our sport environment. We also see a number of the issues relevant to sport reflected in our programs at Rural Roads. So I really love that we've been able to partner with many sport organizations and with Game Plan in particular to welcome athletes into our programs. We tackle similar concepts that sport does through development, diversity and inclusion, education, environment, equity and human rights, health, media and communication, and peace. And we know the power of sport to influence change. And we've seen that really present in our sport experiences over the last year through COVID, people taking advantage of their platforms to demonstrate true character and courage in making change in the world. And so welcome to episode 6, Fostering Diversity and Inclusion in and through sport. In sport, because sport has its challenges, diversity and inclusion challenges, but also sport can be that vehicle for advancing diversity and inclusion in our society. I want to draw your attention to our bonus feature this time. I think we have a couple actually, but I just interviewed Dan O'Thorne, and he's a member of the Cowichan First Nation, Director of Sport and Recreation for Cowichan, and has been a women's soccer coach for many years and a soccer coach for many years. But he took the women's team to the World Indigenous Games several times. They were champions 2015, 2017. And he tells a wonderful, just really passionate reflection of his experience at those games with those young women, and the impact it's had on him and also them, and just speaks so brilliantly, insightfully, and passionately about the power of sport to really support community and support individuals. I want to, thank you so much for sharing where you're coming from in the chat, and we love it when people are participating in the chat. I also want to encourage you to post questions there. We can touch on those. We'll have some time toward the end. I'd like to introduce the members of our panel today. We have Gololcha Boru. He's coming to us from Winnipeg, and he's a political refugee from Ethiopia. His family was soccer enthusiast, and as he just said to me before we started, it'll be something, his kind of life work. He'll never stop welcoming new Canadians through soccer into Winnipeg. He's a community development officer with the City of Winnipeg and former program manager for IRCOM. And also a student at the University of Winnipeg in the past. So I'm sure there'll be connections there for people. We also have Carolyn Trono. Carolyn and I go way back to the 80s where we rode together, and I think we raced down the head of the Charles course at one point together. Carolyn steering a mean course. She's the director of long-term athlete development at Sport for Life, and was a rower at Coxswain, it's called, where you steer the boat. And here she is in her glory days at UVic with all of these women made it to the national team at different times. And she's busy, of course, as in her role with Sport for Life, but she also is very involved with Gololcha in welcoming new Canadians through sport into their communities. And it's just such a beautiful endeavor. I've heard them both now speak quite passionately about the impact that's had, and we'll hear more today. Stephanie Dixon is going to be our chef de mission, I should say, for the 2021 Paralympic Games in Tokyo. And she's up in Whitehorse today with her puppy, and owner of Motivational Coaching in Whitehorse, ambassador of Canadian Tire, and so many awards and acknowledgements of her efforts, both in the pool and out of the pool, to advance the values of sport in society. So thank you for joining us, Stephanie. And John Lyall. John Lyall and I have known each other for quite a while now too. He's done some amazing work in the world of rugby. Member of the Kwakiutl First Nation, VP at Edward Milne School, but just shared a new role that he's going to be playing right next to Rural Roads. There's a high school there too. President of the Vancouver Island Rugby Union and founder and program director of Thunder Rugby. And I'd love to hear more about that. Dano and I talk lots about Indigenous leagues and how crucial they are. Rugby Canada Community Service Award winner, of course, in 2017 as well. And Marnie McBean. And Marnie is our chef de mission for the Olympic Games in 2021 as well. And she's a 3-time Olympian, medalist winner, and has just such great stories with her wonderful partner, Kathleen Heddle. We rode together for many years in the 90s. Again, a highly respected member of the sporting community, and does a lot of work with different organizations. Fantastic speaker. I want to highlight that as well. And an author. Great book. Check it out, Power of More. Reminder to pose questions in the chat. And we'll try to get to those toward the end, but maybe throughout as well. I have a couple of times where we'll pause. I'm going to stop sharing now my screen, and let's meet our panelists. I'm going to pull up my little questions here as well. Awesome. So what I like to do is always just start off with, and you can always change your view so that you have speaker view, and that way you'll see just the people who are speaking at the moment, or the panel themselves. You can change to that. I want to start by just asking you each to give a little bit more of an introduction. You know, I've given the highlight reel for each of you, of course, but I'd love to hear more about what brought you to sport, what sport means to you. How do you find yourself in sport? You know, having done sport yourself, or representing, working for sport now in your careers. And how about we start with Stephanie, giving me a big smile there, so I'll pick on you first.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Jen. And I'm just so honored to be here. I think the power sport is just so vast, and discussions like this are so rich and helpful to help us all gain new perspectives on how we can move forward and make our sport system better. And sport has always been a part of my life. Ever since I was 2 years old, I was put into the swimming pool where I turned into a little mermaid. And I grew up with a disability, but my parents put me in so many different sports that disability for me growing up didn't mean anything other than a descriptor of how I looked. I was missing a leg. Anything about my abilities or what I was able to do, because I learned through sport that my body is powerful and capable. And it was so important that I learned that, because I eventually became an age where I realized that there's a lot of parts of society that do look at and treat people with disabilities as if they are less capable. And that has a really powerful impact on someone's self-esteem, on how they feel, like what their place in the world is, their worth. And so I am just so grateful to sport for giving me very obvious evidence that I am capable, and all people are capable and powerful. And for those of us who have unique bodies, sometimes we just have to get a bit creative. And sport gives us the platform to do that, to get creative, to learn our own bodies, and to think outside of the box, and to really see the possibilities of human potential. So I'm very passionate about sport and very honored to be here and a part of this conversation.
We're so happy to have you. Thank you. And it's been wonderful getting to know you over the years. And how well said. Thank you. I'm taking notes, and it's recorded, of course, too, so we can pass this out afterward to those who couldn't make it. But I find myself going back and listening again as well, because there's so many pearls of wisdom that people are sharing. And Marnie, how about you? Oh, and before we go to Marnie, actually, I just want to highlight that if we'll kind of riff after this, we'll do this round table, and then we'll start to pose a question and people can jump in. Just turn your mic on when you're ready to comment, and I'll pay attention. I can pick up on that, no problem. Okay, Marnie, your mic's on, so you're ready to go.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for including me on the panel. I'm looking forward to this. I feel like I will probably take more notes. As always from sport, I'll learn more from it than anything. You know, in your question, I think, you know, I think for a long time I took sport for granted, right? I took the impacts that it had on me as a person, as a woman, and then I didn't even figure out I was gay until I was in my 30s. And I think even the impact of sport, like all of it, I really took for granted. Because I remember when I came out of sport, like when I came out the other side and I was this like confident, strong, like I thought everything I was doing was normal when I came out, and people started asking me, how are you doing that? Like, how is that possible? And it strangely, it was even in a conversation yesterday that I realized that when I went to the rowing club for the first time, I saw these women who were, they had such an energy. You know, it's not everyone's an extrovert, but they're gregarious and outgoing. And I don't know, it empowered me. And so I'm sure we'll get to all that in the conversation. So I don't want to start off with a long answer at the intro. but I'm here now because I've learned the hidden impact of sport on all the different things, on me as a person, on me as a woman, and as myself as a member of the LGBT community. And I know there's a lot more initials, but sometimes I get nervous and I don't, I stop. But I've learned it, and then I've started giving back, and even as I do that, like, I've learned a lot about you know, default conversations that I've had on my own, and you know, just things that I took for granted. And so now I'm in sport trying to undo that privilege and trying to share what I've learned. So I'm looking forward to continuing to learn.
Love that. And it does take a bit to learn what you've learned, hey, in sport. I found the same, and I think we could do a better job maybe of helping people be more aware, but maybe it's just that it does take time. Wonderful to see you always. All right. How about Carolyn? While you're stable.
I hope it remains
Thank you.
that way. So yeah, it freezes, and I don't know, sure. Kids are getting home from school, so I think they're all going on to play their games and stuff. Anyway, thank you so much for having me. It is a great honor to be here with everyone, and I'm in Winnipeg. And I guess the sport for me, it has been kind of a lifelong journey. I'm 30 plus years in the sports system, probably maybe even a little bit more, right? And you think back of, you know, you're being quite young and participating in sport, multi-sport, and then as an athlete, and then as a coxswain, and then working through the sports system, locally coaching, and then worked at the provincial level, the national level with national sport organizations, and now working with multi-sport organizations as well. So you have this broad perspective of everything and what sport brings, and it really, you have this great opportunity to meet so many fantastic people, right? You have this fantastic network of people who are phenomenal. But my world changed in 2016, and Gololcha, you know, this is when I met Gololcha, is our mainstream sports system is a system almost unto ourselves, and there's a whole group there that isn't really included. So the last 5 years, I'm going, is what I'm seeing true? Because I had this vision, this perception of what sport is, and it can be great for everyone, but we're missing a segment, or maybe it's a large segment. And so my years, I had a certain perspective, and it's changed my worldview. So making sure that those opportunities that were afforded to me, and many are those opportunities for others, and in particular at the community level. So I've worked many years at a national level, but not being immersed in the community level, outside my normal, where I normally reside, right? And it really has changed. So 30 plus years, but those last 5 years ago, wow, we can do better. So that's kind of my little journey. Yeah.
Right. Always learning and noticing, and being, I don't know, brought more aware of what needs to change. Hey, and let's lead right into Gololcha, because he has lots of stories to share eventually too, I'm sure. I'd love to hear more about, of course, what you're working on and how you found each other. But Gololcha, how did you find yourself in sport? Why still sport? You told me you're going to stick with it for the rest of your life.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with the rest of the panelists as well. My introduction to sports started when I came to Canada as a refugee with my parents, and found myself in Winnipeg, downtown Winnipeg, where Carolyn is doing most of her work, where there is somewhat of a sport desert, if you would like to call, in terms of opportunities of entry into sport. I was somewhat fortunate to get my way through the door into sport. And as a young individual, I grew up playing soccer and basketball into my late teens. And I think the biggest thing for me was it provided me a space and of where I could be, a child, a youth. Sometimes for a lot of newcomers, refugees, immigrants, there is a complete shift on the landscape, new language, new environment, new culture, new people, and there's expectations for you that are kind of not what people would consider as normal expectations for any child or youth. You have examples of, young people translating documents, going to appointments, because, they're the first ones to really grasp the language. So, I fell out a little bit in my early 20s, but I've come back, and in a lot of my work with refugees and young people, I fought for this space to be more inclusive and open. And, there's conversations on how can we make it more diverse. The first question that we are trying to always ask is how can we even come into the door when it comes into sport? And so, I've met Carolyn, and we've been working on many different projects, and in other ventures as well in Winnipeg, there's been some momentum in opening the door when it comes to sport for all, not only newcomers, but Indigenous peoples as well. So yeah, that's my story for now.
Thank you. Welcome. And John Lyall, tell us how you got started. Why sport? What's it meant to you? Oh, we need you unmuted. There we go. Say
You think 14 months into this,
I
I'd figure out I'm mute by now. Sometimes I say I'm most profound things on mute, but I will get a cast all new moving and guide to like a quack. Good morning, all. My name is John. I'm moving kin from my family's quack from northern Vancouver Island. I've been playing rugby most of my life, but as I sort of neared the end of my career, I was talking to Phil Mack, who's a Canadian rugby legend and from Tukwat First Nation of the Nuchal peoples on the West Coast here, and a few others. And we started talking about Indigenous rugby and wouldn't it be cool, and those kind of coffee conversations. And then we decided to take the leap, and we've been out for about 6 years now. One of the things we tell our kids when we bring them together is Numwayut, which is we are all one, or not Samat down in Coast Salish language here. It's in Chothan, I believe. And we have such a diverse group of kids that join us, and so we want to try to create a sense of who we are and where we come from right away. And Indigenous sport, and particularly in rugby, is quite popular throughout the world. And the New Zealand All Blacks are obviously the epitome of a group of athletes that have gained the self-confidence from knowledge of who they are and where they're from. When I was in university, Lorna Williams would say that our children we're kind of stuck off in between two worlds, and for us as Indigenous people to gain confidence, it's either having complete self-confidence in our culture and who in that, or perhaps abandoning that and just going perhaps by a non-Indigenous sort of views. But the challenges are, I think most of our kids and most of our youth are sort of stuck in the middle of those views, and they're kind of in this sort of polarizing tension. And our kind of goal was we'd like our youth to be have a strong sense of that identity in place. That's the kind of way we try to push them. We try to have a lot of fun as well. So bringing one of our youth said to us, we said, "Why is Thunder Rugby important?" And he said, similar type thing. He said his parents told him he lived in two worlds. You have to live in two worlds to be Indigenous youth. And he says Thunder Rugby is the only place where, in his experiences, that both those worlds are being brought together. So, we're doing a few things right, but we're certainly we certainly have some more goals and some more things to accomplish. We're still having some fun.
Right on, right on. And it's so cool, right, to hear it from a kid. The kids articulate it so well that it's been brought together there. I was chatting with Dano yesterday about how, well, it struck me as he was speaking that, you know, we can't have inclusion. We can't include people until they know who they are, right? And we have that sense of diversity, and they have a safe place to identify who they are, what their identity actually is. What can we learn through sport about this? So more on that. What have you learned through your experience in sport about belonging, inclusion, how important it is to really know who you are, what your identity is? What has sport taught you? And here's where just turn your mic on and I will respond to whoever's ready to talk about that. Anybody like to go first?
I can jump in.
Yeah.
I think for me, one of the most valuable things that I've learned is that sport doesn't discriminate. Humans discriminate. So sport is very inclusive. And I've seen this through my experience in the Paralympic Games, that sport can be done, the human body can be expressed in countless numbers of ways. And it's so inspiring every time you see sport demonstrated in a different way by a different type of a body, or just from a different perspective. And we see that culturally or from bodies, different genders. And so sport inspires me, and I think we can learn a lot through the inclusivity of sport and the adaptability and how creative sport can be, because it is our systems that discriminate or leave people out, that impose either misconceptions or limitations on other human beings. So I'm often very inspired by my experience in sport, and hoping that our sport system will learn and be inspired and want to be implemented based on those basic foundations that sport is inclusive by nature.
Right on, and diverse by nature, right? I mean, Marnie and I rode together, and in aid, you had to have different people. You couldn't all be just these automatons that were homogenous. You know, it doesn't work. And I'd love to hear, I just don't want to forget to come back to that idea of the distinct community. So having an Indigenous rugby, Indigenous soccer, para, you know, is the same. We have a separate, and I've chatted with para athletes about that. Like, do you want to just integrate and assimilate, or is it, there's a pro and a con to that, hey? So I want to come back to that, but don't let me forget. What else? Marnie, what has it taught you?
Well, I actually think I'm learning that it is what Stephanie said and what you're saying, but it is also quite the opposite. Like, there's an element of, you know, when you come to sport and you're on a team, you know, you fit in. Like, honestly, like, you talk about our team, Jen, and the group of women that we had, that we were all these like really different people when we came together. And my wife came to a training camp that we had once, and she's like, you guys are like a cult. You guys all buy into the same thing. And, you know, you kind of all, like, we're all these different people that eventually we go, okay, and we all do the same thing. You know, and I'm thinking about that night row, you know, whatever, but I won't get into that. But, you know, there is, sport can within really make you feel comfortable, but also if you don't fit into the norms, I can see now, and I think it's kind of like Carolyn was saying, like, you have these epiphanies that you think it's like this really inclusive environment, but it's super inclusive if you fit in. And so I think one of the things we're learning, and just the other day I heard out of Vancouver speaking, now he's got the position of a member of parliament, and he's talking about sport funding. And he's like, well, sport funding is really great, but he now sees how it has to be used to bring in new people to sport. It's not about just helping people in the system get better and move up. It's how do you know, we're always talking about this, broaden the base. But I now see that the environments that we're in, we're getting way better at recognizing we need more like diversity. So it's as much as sport does welcome it can be used as an incredible tool, but you know, you got to be in it to win it, kind of thing. And that's kind of one of the things I'm sort of just, you know, I suppose that's going to be my next sort of blossoming in sport leadership, is trying to speak for the people who aren't in the room and get them in the room so that I can learn, like I only knew like a little fraction of what they had to offer.
Right. So it can be inclusive, but it can also be very normative and kind of insular, hey, and force us all into this little box. So great to recognize that, and you learn that through sport. The question for Carolyn's sake is, and we'll get to Gololcha here, what can we learn through sport about the value of diversity and inclusion, or about how it works? Why don't I go to Gololcha and then to Carolyn? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for me, I think one of the, when I was a kid and a young adult, maybe I wasn't aware of it as clear as I am now. But I think for me, one of the real things I've learned through sport is harsh. Sport is, I understand what Stephanie was saying, how the systems within sport can be not as open and as not as welcoming. But to me, I include them together. I think that sport in the Winnipeg example, it's not as easy as just saying, it's welcoming, it's this. For a lot of young people in our city, if they don't have the opportunity to play sport, we don't have them anymore. Like, we lose them. And I think people within our sports system in Manitoba, and in particular in Winnipeg, still don't understand that. I've lost so many young men and women because there wasn't that avenue, that place for them to go play, to make those relationships that Marnie's talking about, to fall in love with the game, because they are not seen as people that would go in and participate, or they have not even been offered the opportunity to. So, I had my first real example in 2017. We had an amazing team of young people that wanted to play a particular sport. We were denied. And within the next 3 years, of a member of 18 people on that team, 6 of them have passed. So I think it's great. We can talk about being inclusive and welcoming, but I think the urgency of it isn't really communicated to a lot of sport leaders, not only in Winnipeg, but I'm sure I've heard stories in Toronto, Montreal, Calgary. It's something that I think people don't understand, the real value sport can bring to some communities.
Yeah, on this sort of superficial level, we can have a team and everybody has a little role to play on around the baseball diamond or something. But more deeply, you're seeing a real barrier there, that the access just isn't there. We're operating in this little echo chamber where we're not very aware of how inaccessible it can be, because we're all in it, so we're a bit oblivious. Great points there, Gololcha. And Carolyn, any things to add? What do you think it could be?
Yeah, and it's funny that I'm really glad that you went to Gololcha first, because I was going to say something and Gololcha has taught me so much, right? So this perspective of not having access, I see it now, and how hard it is to get some of our newcomer kids into the mainstream sports system for many, many reasons, all of the barriers. But I think one of the things that we can learn through sport is to really appreciate differences. And yes, when you're on a team, there are norms but it's in the getting there. And there's more than one way. And what people bring, their history that they bring to the table, is something that can expand worldviews within a team, right? And so an example is one of the boys on our in our group, very, very early on, I think it was 2017, his name was Ahmed. And it took forever to get him registered, not because it took forever to get him registered, but to have someone drive him there, to get the paperwork done, to get the kids' sport, to get the rides, all of these things, right? That were really, really hard, a barrier. And then I went to the last game to thank the managers, to thank the families, to thank everybody who helped Ahmed get there. It was a fairly good team, and they really supported him once he got there. And I was walking to the parking lot, and the coach came up to me and said, well, you shouldn't be thanking us. We should be thanking you and Ahmed for sharing the stories of his family, of Syria, the war in Syria, all of these things, because those stories made us better Canadians. So while we think and we are, while we welcome, we're as Canadians, we're also benefiting. And sometimes we forget that, like, we need diversity to make us better Canadians. And this is the part that was a real, again, another bucket of water over my head. And when I met Gololcha for the first 2 or 3 times, and it continues, he says things in a way that makes me go, oh, never thought of it that way. And this is you go, oh, we could be doing this differently. Let's listen to more Gololchas.
And John has a comment, and Marnie on deck here. And yes, that being willing to actually check your biases, right? And open up a little bit and be aware. Yeah, thank you, John. And then Marnie, go ahead.
Oh, sure. See, what was the exact question again? Sorry.
Diversity and inclusion, and how we learn that through sport, or what it teaches us about it, whether, the good or the bad or the ugly. What do you think?
All right. Well, some of the good and the bad, the ugly. I mean, often in sport, if the socioeconomics take place pretty quickly, if you want to advance, it's like in rugby, our sport, for instance. Congratulations, you just made the U17 national team. Next week, we're going to Italy. Please send us a check for $3,500. Which clearly funnels who can afford to advance, and who can represent the province and or the country. That's a challenge. I don't know if the answer to that, because going to places does cost money. It was interesting though, in my sport, particularly in rugby, I was talking to someone from Seattle, and when he was introducing the sport to, I guess, communities, and perhaps communities at risk or communities of diverse, he was more presenting the greater community amongst the team, rather than just maybe that group of people that feel tied up their boots, for instance. And he was sort of saying, like, particularly in the rugby world, it's real often, amongst the clubs, it's a very extended family connection, which was interesting. He said you'll rarely ever find an out of work or unemployed or homeless person around a rugby club, because they'll generally gotta get picked up by that greater community of people that now you have to sort of buy into the greater vision of the greater good of the community or the team, but there is that sort of, which was an interesting perspective, because I found myself, before, trying to sell the sport itself, the 80 minutes of exhilaration, rather than perhaps the familyhood that sort of came along with it.
Yeah, that community piece, right? And so diverse, being inclusive means actually broadening that community out, so that we are more aware of the challenges all the people are facing and helping them get there, like Carolyn was talking about as well. Yeah, I loved that about rugby, loved it, appreciated and benefited from it tremendously. And Marnie, comments?
I liked John's idea of, it's not about the moments of play on the field. It's bigger than that. But if I look at the chat and people are asking, like, how do we introduce more people? How do we address practical barriers? Like, we need policy change. Jen, when you asked me to this conversation, I know this year I wear this hat as chef de mission for Team Canada. So I went to the COC and I'm like, what are you guys doing about this? Like, I know you're saying it's important, but like, what are you doing? And they've actually, they're winning awards this year for really stepping up and recognizing and I'm not doing this as some sort of like, I'm not like, I'm just proud of what they're doing. But they recognize things like within their executive coaching, they were going and getting like, oh, hi, like, you know, middle-aged white man, would you mentor this other middle-aged white man? And hi, middle-aged white woman, would you mentor this other middle-aged white woman? And so they had a lot of, you know, it was like really homogeneous what was going on in their executive levels for their mentoring. And so they weren't broadening their thought on the communities they were thinking about. And then for the pipeline of who was going to come into the programs, they recognized that their internships, you know, they had been unpaid internships. And who gets to do like an unpaid internship? Who has the resources to work for free? But like, you know, people who have privilege. So they changed that. They now hit all 100% paid privilege, paid internships. And they're making it like a real focus on making sure that at 50% of these, at least 50% of these internships are BIPOC, representing BIPOC communities. And so I was like, okay, so this is starting to really come in through change, right? So getting these voices at the table, and so it's going to be people who are going, well, no, because I have to admit, I've never played hockey. I've never played hockey. My brother, we used to go on the street, and my brother would fire the ball at me until I went home crying. I thought, and my brother he was actually really bad, so I didn't even like going and watching him play. And then, you know, but I never played hockey. And so this national love for hockey, and there's how many people are on this call? 124 people. You could out me for being like, I don't know, this is maybe the most un-Canadian thing I've ever said. But it drives me nuts that we talk about this as our national sport, because it's so excluding, right? We have this sport that if you haven't, you know, as a kid, if you haven't learned to skate by the time you're 8, right? You're just, well, you know, if you move to Canada as a 12-year-old, well, not hockey, right? It's the worst sport. Like, okay, it's a lovely sport, whatever, but it's not. Anyways, it's like, it's such an excluding sport, but it's this kind of thing where they, you know, we have to try to grow this inclusion in it. But, you know, back to my first point about the decision makers, you know, how are we going to change? It's because in all the decision-making policies, people like you, Jen, have panels like this, and people like us listen, and then we go and we ask questions about other groups, and we find that there is systemic change going on in the executive levels, which is going to be where funding comes from, and in the pipeline levels, so we can bring people in from different areas and bring these voices into the table who are going to think about the inclusion and understand the importance of language. Like for me, as a member of the LGBT community, and even late to the party, God, I wish I'd known. I missed so many good parties, but I late to the party, like it's language. It's the default language. Like, so, you know, when you go up to a group of women and they say like, who's your boyfriend, right? Like, you know, instead of saying, you know, I don't have a boyfriend, I have a girlfriend. It's forcing me to come out every time, you know. But so this like whole this default language, you know, these things that we learn because people who are decision makers come into the room and they teach us to be more aware of the language we're using. And sorry, Jen, I can go anywhere. I'm probably ruining the flow of your conversation. But, you know, the language that we use, and I've done this with Steph. We were having a conversation and I said something and she got very mad with me. And she taught me a lot about the language that I needed to use when I'm talking about the Paralympics and Paralympians. You know, and I was like, okay, I felt really embarrassed in the moment, but I was so happy that she taught me the lesson, and then I can be more aware.
Really? This way.
It's okay, someone just off mute. Thank you, Russ. And you've touched on a lot of things.
What the heck?
If I could just ask you, there we go. Okay, touched on a lot of things there, but what I'm hearing from everyone is this idea of expanding our view to be more community oriented. Like think about, and you said it originally, Marnie, about the people not in the room. And that takes intentionality, doesn't it? And a real surfacing of assumptions, which touches on the language. We operate in a very colonized world, right? And so many groups are facing the oppression of language. There isn't language available for you sometimes even, right? So there can be so many exclusive factors. John touched on the financial, and that's come up in the chat as well, language, and also like people facing a barrier in terms of their language, and parents who are available to support, the money that needs to be available, the access to roles and positions. But it starts with that broadening our awareness and challenging each other to do so, which you described with your interaction with Stephanie, and we've had those conversations. Right on. So keep going. What other barriers? We're seeing a bit in the chat here, and keep having that conversation in the chat. That's awesome. And frankly, yeah, hockey can be a really exclusive sport because of the cost. I've heard coaches warn people off. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Marnie, I can't remember exactly the nature of our conversation, but I'm so glad that you were open, and I hope that it was in a kind way, whatever we were chatting about. But you know, as we're talking about limitations, and Marnie had touched on this as well, and it's who are the decision makers and who are the people at the table, because at the end of the day, like all of us here today are bringing our own personal experience, but there's no one who's an expert in all diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we have just lived in our own experience. And so it takes diversity at the decision-making table in order to create a diverse system. And so Marnie had touched on what the COC is doing, like to recognize that, because a whole bunch of privileged middle-aged white people cannot make a diverse system. It's just not going to happen, because we can only see through our own lens and our own perspective. And so I think that, you know, when we're talking about, you know, barriers and for people with disability, you know, which is my background and my perspective, is just we want to, it's visibility. It's having role models. So seeing people with disability who are in positions of being leaders and role models in the media, and then who's at the decision-making table. And right now, you know, like at the Paralympic committee, there are not a lot of people with disabilities working there. So, you know, I mean, in our entire sports system, where are the people with disabilities who can speak to their experience and knowledge on what are the barriers for people living with disabilities to participate in sport, from a financial perspective, a physical accessibility perspective, as also like inclusion. And if we just leave the door wide open and we say we're open to everyone, that doesn't lead to inclusion. And I think we really have to ask ourselves, like, who's missing, who's excluded here? And a couple of people have touched on that point. And then go out of our way to build that trust back, because when a group of people has been scared away from a sports system, it's not just having the door wide open and saying we're open to everybody. It takes the bridge from the beginning of your presentation really reminded me of that, is that it takes energy and effort and finances to rebuild lost connections and to reach back out to communities who have felt overlooked or pushed away in order to bring them back in. So I think that, yeah, these are the thoughts that are popping up, and I'm just, yeah, so happy to have these conversations and make sure that we're all changing our own views and biases so we can be part of a more inclusive system.
Yeah, go ahead. The specifics are so important too. You know, Roberta here raises the idea of citizenship can get in the way. Someone discovers and it just blows something dead. Gololcha gives that example of a team kind of just being stifled. No, we can't play, and then you end up having tragic consequences, right? But the specifics, we need to learn about them so we can tackle them with that intentional energy. Gololcha.
Yeah, I agree with Stephanie, what she was saying. I recently read a report that said 20% of Canadian youth say they're not going to go back into sport after COVID because of the huge layoff and the effects that they have. And I think there's a huge opportunity there in that consultation. I think working with a lot of young people as well, you know, organizations, sport organizations don't really consult them. They're the biggest, you know, they're the one playing the game, but there's no real input or space for them to provide their feedback, you know, other than maybe to their coaches. But I think to the real sport organizers and sport leaders, I think that's if we want to, you know, the idea, and I'm still torn about the idea of like build back better. I think we should just smash everything to the ground and build something brand new. But there has to be some avenue and space for young people to voice what they would like to see when it comes to sport, because I think the discussion as well, I know maybe I'm bringing in COVID, but I think COVID really represents a real challenge, coming from my background in working with, predominantly newcomer children and youth. We haven't been able to play sport for almost 2 years. And, the very few youth that we do get to play sport, it's a big challenge for them to miss out on that. But what's going to happen to those who've never experienced it? They're so far along in their journey in their integration process into Canada. What is that going to mean for them? So I think there's a lot of avenues and places for consultation and engagement from sport leaders as well.
And intentional programming around that, recognizing we need to be open those doors, but then very intentionally engaging, right? And reaching out, researching where are the barriers, who are the people who we're not listening to, and putting that work in there. And I'll we record this, so I will summarize a lot of the action items that emerge from these conversations, and we share them around with our students actually, but I'll post that as well, because people who are either listening or following up after can, you inspire people to say, I'm going to pursue that as a research project, or I'm going to tackle that as a program. Sport can develop leaders that can then move into these ranks of decision makers, but we have to get the athletes involved first, right? And great point, Gololcha, about listening to the actual stakeholders, the actual athletes. There aren't really that many forums and avenues for athletes to be heard on a number of issues. Other comments about what's getting in the way here? Yeah, go ahead, Claire-Lynn, welcome back.
Okay, so I'm hoping this is still unstable, but I think there's a few things that there's lots of research out there. What do people want from sport? They want connection, they want fun, they want to belong. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's fine. It's a little bit,
yes,
risky, but you're fine. Yeah.
So yeah, so these are some of the things that people want, and with that sense of belonging. And some of the newcomer kids, when we first start, they say, I want to play with the Canadian kids, or I met a new Canadian friend at the skating rink, or these kinds of these things of inclusion. And yet, is our system inclusive, or is it built on a system of exclusion? So if you're not on the performance pathway, or you're not making the school team, where to next? So, and these are some of the things to explore. Sure, not everyone is going to be on an Olympic team, but we want everyone to participate in sport and physical activity. So how do we do that? And perhaps maybe the model changes a little bit. Maybe the system changes a little bit to make sure that everyone can be accommodated, so that we truly listen to what people want. We co-create, we include youth, and we make sure our system sets up accordingly. And everyone say, well, there aren't enough facilities, or there isn't enough resources. So we function on this scarcity model, and everyone's competing, but it's not really the most positive environment. It can be for some, but if there wasn't just one way, and we were creative about it, it's that beautiful constraint. How do we come around to another way of doing it? Maybe not everybody plays soccer all at once. Maybe it's different sports. Maybe there's another approach that we could use, but the environment should be that we figure out it's not the pyramid, what's the rectangle, so we include everyone, but it's breaking it down a little bit, so we're not, it's not a scarcity model, because we know that the research shows, like in those where they do the studies, when you create a scarce resource, everybody changes how they do things. Mm-hmm. And it's not always all that positive, right? So we need to fix that.
And as Stephanie kicked us off, right, we can be so creative. We know that's what sport teaches us to do. You watch kids figure out how to pull together a game of shinny or baseball or basketball. They'll always figure it out.
How neat would it be if the success of our Canadian sports system was measured by 100% of all Canadian kids participating in sport, and we have so many different measures for how we define success, but as Carolyn is speaking there, just like how neat if our goal was 100% of Canadian kids participates in a variety of different sports, and then you just let it blossom from there. I think that would just be such a beautiful shift of paradigm.
Love it. And that's another lever, right? What we measure, what we value, what we promote. A few people in the chat, I just want to keep drawing people's attention there too. There's a good discussion going on, but the media plays a role, what they're promoting, what they're highlighting, the stories, and we can have influence, right? We can share those, do op-eds. John, did you have your hand up earlier? I don't want to miss you. Okay. Marnie, trying to break in. What else? What else is going? Yeah, I think we're all looking at the chat.
No, sorry, I was, I think, I think of all the different times, like where in sport, we're one of the biggest lobby groups that does nothing, right? Like, if you look at the number of people who volunteer for sport, if those people actually voted on issues that were important, we can make change, but we don't. We tend to value other things. And I remember I sat on, a scholarship for a couple of years, and it was kids in their last year of high school. And so I got to look at their transcripts, these kids who are like just these amazing leaders within their schools. And because it was an interview process, I got to grill them on why they had all dropped like physical education. And they're like, well, I can't keep my marks up in that, right? Like if part of phys ed is there's health, which you can get a great score on a health exam. But on phys ed, if you're shooting free throws and you get 8 out of 10, that's better than an NBA player, but it's only 80%. And for a lot of kids who are going for scholarships, that's like a pretty shitty mark. And so they were all dropping it. And IB programs, they drop out of sport and stuff like that because they can't keep the team. And so there's this element that we haven't actually, as communities and as voting members, voted for the importance of sport and valued it. Like we're always like, well, those math marks, when who's probably the Swedish or something like that, because they always do studies on this. They're like, well, if you keep physical education, your math actually goes up. But there's all these things that we haven't done there. But I wonder, going into this whole time, right, where how we've excluded so many people and so many populations from inclusion in sport. And I have to say, I often want to just include drama and music in this too. I don't think everybody wants to do sport, but maybe they want to do drama and music. Fine, I'm good with that, right? Like I think it should be. I think it should be mandatory that when you're graduating from school, you have credits in either physical education, drama, or music, like something that is in that sort of creative way. But I wonder if there is, we're at this moment of opportunity, right, where we have been sent home. There is a reset that's coming by the pandemic, and as much as 20% of kids aren't going to come back to sport, that's across the board. That's not just the diversities. That's like all kids. We're losing, we've always lost young girls at a certain age group. And there's, whether it's, BIPOC communities, whoever it's going to be really hard getting people back. But there has been sort of this trending, right? And, one of the questions you gave us sort of offline before to be thinking about this. And I was like, well, I don't think Colin Kaepernick taking a knee was really the thing. But then athletes started talking about it, and in the community, in the Olympic and the Paralympic community, Rule 50 becomes a really big deal on how do athletes voice themselves. So athlete committees have been getting a lot more power, a lot more say, because instead of as an organization and as chef de mission, Steph and I are the ones who have to enforce this. If a Canadian athlete does something on the podium, we're the ones who's supposed to go up to them and going like, congratulations on that medal, but that demonstration you just did on the podium, like we're technically the one who have this conversation with them and say, well, you've broken Rule 50 and there's a possibility the IOC want that medal back. Like that's the shittiest job for me. I don't want to do that because I might think that the athlete was, I understand why they did it. Mm-hmm. Anyways, so instead of the organization telling the athletes what to do, we've been asking our athletes committees, like, what do you want to do? What do you think is important? And it turns out that over 2/3 of athletes have said they don't think it's right to do that. But then it's 1/3 of athletes who's probably being, you know, oppressed or having that problem that they need to speak out. So again, I'm like, it's still a huge problem, and I'm coming around. So now the athletes committees, we've been listening to them more. So athletes are having more voice. And then, you know, through this whole pandemic, we have the horrific incident, and there's not like it's the only one or it's an isolation, you know, everything that happened to George Floyd. And so now there's a lot of shame going along in white communities, like, and just realizing, you know, it's been brought to a head. So now we're really looking with the athletes having a voice and this realization that we need to be doing more. And I know in the Olympic and the Paralympic community, we've been amplifying the voices of our athletes. And in Victoria, where you are, you got Charity Williams and Pam Busha, who have been organizing, you know, Black Lives rallies. And they've just really had this chance to come home. And instead of being so focused on sport, they're focused on their community. So like John's saying, it's not just about the sport and what's happening on the field of play. Finally, they're getting to be advocates for their Black community, and Black Lives Matter. So here we come. Now, when we start fighting back for people to get back into sport, there's a possibility now that if we use these voices that we're talking about now, that we're not trying to just get, you know, people back to sport. We're trying to get more people into sport, right? And grow it from there and use this opportunity. And I think that's why we're here, right? If we go back to why it was sport, it's because I don't want people just rowing. I want people doing anything. I want them to find, you know, what, you know, makes their heart sing in the sport that they do, in the activity, to feel like they're part of a community, you know, so that they have someone to support them up and lean on. Like John's saying, it's how you get a job. It's how you stay in school. It's how you learn, you know, how to be safe. It's how you learn to be empowered. It's how you feel to be part of a community and how to be Canadian. And I think we're at this point where we can really grow it. And in these conversations, we have to make sure that we leave these conversations and go, I heard this thing, and it's so important to share it with you.
Great points. And this idea of welcoming people, helping them find the sport that helps their heart sing, or drama, or art, you know, and these are all areas where we can explore who we are, music. And yet the funding isn't always there. And I'm seeing Janet post that, you know, you only need 1 PE credit in all of your high school transcript in Ontario. So how do we really make these changes? I want to come back to that question of the initiatives, right? We've got ideas of these programs, and a lot of people in the chat are highlighting programs that are happening, like what Carolyn and Gololcha are working on for new Canadians, refugees, what John's working on, what Daniel's working on. And there was a question in the chat around how do we promote diversity and recognize people for who they are? And it's that question I posed to you early, Steph, too, where we're by segregating, but then not segregating. Like, how do we balance that? We don't isolate, but they do need a place where they feel safe enough to really explore who they are, and then they can start to maybe integrate without being like blurred in and assimilated. That's not what we're looking for. What works? John?
Hello?
Hi. What's working with your program? Now, why do you think it's important to have Thunder Rugby alongside VLOX or whatever?
Well, yeah, I think this is an interesting question. One of the things is that we don't, in our program, specifically segregate. We say we focus on Indigenous youth, but we're open to everyone. And we get a lot of non-Indigenous youth that want to join us, and that's great. At some point, though, I think, you know, that is our focus. It does appear why we chose rugby is that rugby is still a bit of a, I suppose, a fringe sport for Indigenous communities in BC. There's, I think, 7 identified sports, probably by iSpark, and rugby isn't one of them.
We lost you somehow.
I believe as well, we have sort of goals such as the North American Indigenous Games that, you know, we'd like to focus towards. So those are things like that. It is a good question. We face those same kind of questions in the school system. Like, for instance, do we have First Nations English First Peoples 12? You know, focusing on Indigenous novels and or do we just introduce more of that into English 12? You know, and there's certainly some, I don't have all the answers to that, but there's that's some of the debates we have, or some of the questions we have.
Mhm.
Perhaps, until we get some sort of equity, maybe we are focusing on things like that, and perhaps moving towards a world where we didn't have to do that.
Right.
I do have unfortunately, a
Yes,
work
I know.
meeting I have to
We've
exit
already-
to. So I'd like to thank you, Jennifer, and thank everyone for taking the time. And I wish you all the best. But I got an MS Teams and a Zoom meeting going on at once, so I'm just kind of going crazy. So have a great day, everyone.
Awesome. And you're doing great work. Thanks for finishing off.
Thanks a lot.
And I will share everybody's, Twitter handle or contact, so that if you have questions you want to follow up on with John, please feel free to connect with him. He's a busy guy, but he's very, very involved in the community and really wants to make all this work. How about staff? What do you think? What's the advantage to having something that may appear on the outside more exclusive, and separate, but at the same time, it's there to create a sense of identity and belonging and support, and move us toward more of an integration that respects diversity, rather than just, you have to just assimilate into the mainstream, or, the cult that Marnie described at the beginning, What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a combination approach. I think that there has to be some values in place where, so myself, I swam in a mainstream program, and I want to be allowed to do that. I had the speed to be able to keep up with swimmers with 2 legs. And when I went to my first provincial championships, I was told I couldn't compete because I'm a para athlete. So I can't just decide to swim against people with 2 legs. And so that was my first experience of discrimination in sport. And we fought it and we won. And I got a bronze medal in the provincial championships. And it just, to me, it makes no sense why I would be excluded. We want to provide athletes and kids and adults just the most positive, supportive experience. And so for me, I was able to make that qualification. I should be allowed to compete. But also, if I'm not able to keep up, or if there has to be organizations that are for specific needs or identities of people, especially for groups that have been oppressed, because I think that that's a little bit of that bridge building that I had mentioned before, where not everyone will be either comfortable or able to keep up, or those kinds of things. And so there has to be a combination. So in Canada, I think we're missing a lot of para programs, adaptive programs for kids or adults who have disabilities, and that they're either their skill level or their ability just is not fitting into a mainstream program. And so I think one of the areas we do really, really well in, and I know Marnie Abbott is here on the call and she's a part of this, is wheelchair basketball. So wheelchair basketball in Canada is amazing, and it's very popular, and it's played by people with disability and without disability. So that inclusion goes both ways. So, if we just have wheelchair basketball where you have to have people with disability only, we're not going to get as much diversity or as much participation, depth of competition. And, you think of a case where there's siblings and one has a disability and one doesn't. They want to play together. So why not create a situation where they can play together in wheelchair basketball or what have you. So I think if it's like an adaptive or para program, or a program for newcomers, or an LGBTQ program, and whatever it happens to be, there has to be a safe space and an appropriate space for people, their abilities, their identity to at least, like, as you said, get into sport, feel comfortable, develop their skills. But then for anyone who's ready to jump into mainstream, the mainstream is like, heck yeah, like, come on in, you are welcome here. And we will be creative and open to figuring out how you can participate in this. So I think it really has to be a combination approach, because, for many years in swimming, we had a lot of the higher classifications in swimming on the para side, because almost every pair swimmer had to be in mainstream because they had no other options. So some of the classifications of athletes where their disability was a bit more strong, I guess, or you know, their ability wasn't quite as I don't even know how I want to say it, but where it wasn't appropriate to be in mainstream, we just didn't have those classifications because there was no options. So I think that we have to have, a combination.
Diversity of programming too, right? Yeah. And back to Marnie's point about then helping people find what makes sense for them, which is just good education, right? Good pedagogy. What else do we want to talk about? I had other questions around, you know, seminal moments. Like I remember listening to an interview with Mark Tewksbury where he was remarking on, he had come out 20 years ago and yet still he was kind of the first and kind of only, you know, had really come out and talked about his sexuality. And why would he need to? But because there was stigma, right? And it seems so crazy to us now, but he had to confront that. Where was he safe to do that? Are we any better at making people feel like they belong, that they're safe in sport? Are we coming along there?
We all got quiet. I think so, but not everywhere. I think at the highest levels, yes, right? I think at the Olympic level, yes. It's almost, you know, in a marketing sense, I think you could come out and it's going to play well for you, particularly more so for women. But I don't know at the local level if it's as much, right? Because there's still parents who, for athletes coming out, they're worried for their kids and they think it's a problem, right? And so for sport, you know, young boys, they can hide their sexuality because their dads are like, well, my son plays soccer, or my son plays football, or my son plays hockey, so you know, that dad, he identifies with that son, right? But for the girls, and it's getting better, and I think because we have I don't know, the allyship maybe for women has been really strong. But for girls, there are still a lot of parents who are worried about their daughters getting into like sports that are too physical or too strong, or you know, build too many muscles, which is crazy to say, but it's true. There's still parents. And so at the younger levels, the entry levels of sport, it's maybe not as easy yet, but more and more we're getting examples that are coming out, whether it's like Eric Radford, a figure skater. Like there's just, I'm saying him to go for male athletes, because I think for me, and sometimes I have to be careful because I know lots of athletes and I have to remember who's out, who's not, who's publicly out, who's out to their team. That's another big thing, right? It's for men and women, it's really to come out to your team, but it's kind of like keep it in the locker room. Because like the stigma for me personally, and this is now an old story because I sort of came out maybe 15 years ago, but the stigma of it, when I was first trying to figure it out, I think for a long time I fought the stereotype, and that's because I had a lot of internal homophobia on my own, because within the gay community there's a lot of different ways of expressing yourself. And, everyone sort of would look at sort of a more of I'll probably get in trouble for even my own language on this, but sort of more of a butch female. And I was like, well, I'm not that, I felt more feminine, but I'm not a femme female. I'm not like, so trying to find the right spot for me. And I just thought when someone was telling me that I was lesbian, that they thought I was like butch. And I didn't even want to hang out with butch lesbians because I thought that was going to make me, and so we're getting away from that, but it was still the sense of, don't be too gay, because then everyone's going to paint our whole team with the same brush, and again, that's how I spoke about it earlier, the default language that we use helps people paint with that big brush, instead of diversifying who's in the team and giving different opportunities for athletes within a community to be different people within a community to be different within that community. So I think at the the adult level, right? So when I'm saying that I think it's easier to come out in the sort of the mature side of sport, well, that's because it's a lot easier for a mature person to have the independence to know that, you know, what for sure when I came out, I didn't need the support of my parents. You know, I wasn't risking being kicked out of my house. You know, I wasn't risking, you know, an opinion from my teachers and my parents, my coaches, that would harm me. And there's still quite a lot of, you know, when we talk about streetless youth, a lot of them are part of the LGBT community, and they're either afraid to come out to their family, or they did and they got kicked out. So, you know, that still at the younger level, but it's maybe on the team, it's a safe place, but not outside of that locker room environment. It's changing, it's getting better all the time. But to think that we've created this, like this sport is just this, like, oh, we're so inclusive, we're so great, pat ourselves on the back, work's done. You know, we're not there. We're not there for welcoming our, you know, our new Canadians. We're not there for welcoming, you know, all of our BIPOC communities. You know, we're not there for our disabilities. We're not there for the LGBT community. We still got we're good. Sport's good, but we got a long way to go.
Long way to go. And there's potential to leverage the structure of sport. Like, I love rugby for that. It really welcomes all shapes and sizes, types of abilities. And I love that, but I'm not sure we leverage it as much as we could and really teach the fact that, hey, this is a sport that really acknowledges that everyone has different kinds of strengths and can contribute in different ways because of all the roles you play. Could we do a better job of using sport as an educational tool? We have a few minutes left, and if there are any other questions, we've been kind of paying attention to the chat pretty nicely here. And I wonder if people have, Gololcha, you've got your mic on, and Stephanie, some last words you'd like to share, and observations, or, you know, next steps. We've come up with some pretty practical strategies and solutions. This idea of raising awareness, being intentional about programming, seeking out the voices that are not, and the people who aren't in the room, with greater intention, and following your heart in doing that. You know, like, I really care about high school or schools, and making sure that kids have access to things, exposure to things in schools. And there's some barriers there, but everybody has their own little pet project they want to pursue. Gololcha, what are some last words you'd like to share with the group before we wrap up?
For sure, for sure. I think one of the things that Marnie was saying, I think, is leveraging sports to do better, I think, is one way where we could do some things. I think sport does a really bad job of highlighting the benefits you have once entering, and what the benefits are there for being active for life in sport. I think it's you know, in a lot of the, you know, BIPOC newcomer communities, it's not told about. People don't know about the positive experiences, the social connections, the social capital people do get through sport. And I think that's something where sport leaders should really try to, you know, I don't know how you quantify or qualitative that data or those experiences, but, you know, everyone here has gone on to do something through their connections of sport. And I think for some people, there is that, you know, mentality that's, you know, sports it's just a game. It's just something fun to do. It's not something that is vital or important or should be a part of every single child's life. So I think that's my message. I think, you know, we always are looking to maybe communities and other segmented groups to tell us what's wrong. But I think in this aspect, I think this is an opportunity where I think sport leaders should really highlight what are the positives and get that message out to other communities as well.
And you've done that work. You know, you've reached out to Carolyn, who's in a position with a sport organization. The two of you are now partners. You're advancing initiatives, programming, promoting the value of these. I've heard you now. Both speak very passionately about
But
stories.
I'm talking on a like a larger scale. Like, when you come to this country, you see, oh, they have those guides about like, what are the healthy food groups,
Yeah,
try to eat about, and then, every newcomer immigrant comes here and they want their children to be a doctor or a scientist. I think they should also want their children to play sport. I think that in itself not only integrates the child into the country, but also provides a means for the family, the parent, the mom, the father, to meet other adults, meet other families, and learn from them and understand, what we're all here to do together. So I think that's a really important aspect, where the highlight of, if it's just telling you to go to your local community center and register them in swimming lessons or badminton or whatever it may be. I don't care for what sport it is, but just so that people are active and involved, not only in their sport, but it's another opportunity through sport to engage in their community. And I think sport leaders really have to play onto that connection between sport and community. It's very prominent. I think it's the same across other provinces. I know in Manitoba, a lot of the entry is in through the community level. So I think that's what I would suggest. That's my final words.
beautiful. Like a cultural value, right? That's promoted, just like being safe and healthy eating and being welcoming and polite, but being sporty. That would be a great thing to see us promoting. And someone also, it is Michelle, sport can do a lot better job at telling the story of what sport can do. Great point. Marnie, and then Carolyn.
Well, Michelle, I don't know if it's the same Michelle, but she also mentions that Quebec community subsidies are insane, which makes me think that it's been a systemic problem like across the country, right? Like there has been this passing the buck, right? So communities can no longer afford their own sport and to take care of their own communities, because that community got passed up to the city passed it up to the province passed it up to the feds, and the feds don't really, they can't deal with things on the community level. And so it's been, as municipalities have had, such budget issues, the ability to fund sport and community-based sport for the type of communities who exist there and who are moving there and growing there. It's like in Toronto, we only recently have put in cricket pitches, right? Like they're actually taking out baseball diamonds and putting in cricket pitches, and they're putting in rugby fields, and they're trying to come up with sports that better represent who Toronto is, right? So it is it's so hard, right? Because here we sit here on this conversation and it's just like, oh yeah, get more dollars down to the community level, and there you go. And we can, have the paid interns from different communities who are growing communities, who are being welcoming, who are putting out the pamphlets. And heck, why not make it like, welcome to Canada, and in your first year you have to, have, these proficiencies, we're like, in Quebec, I don't know if it's proper, but, language proficiencies, but also, here is a subsidy for putting your kids under 16 into sport. Welcome to Canada. Like this is because it's going to help language. It's going to help your community involvement. It's going to help you get jobs, right? If we go back to, what John was saying, when you're part of a community, you have a pipeline, you have someone, everyone can climb a ladder once you get your hands on the first rung of the ladder, right? And so that's what we have to do is help people, show them where the ladder is. Because I remember someone says, they can't get in the door because they don't know where the door is. I saw that comment, a while ago in the chat box. But let's build better ladders. Let's build big pointy signs to where the ladders are, and then as a community figure out how to help everyone grab the first rung of the ladder.
Outstanding. And promote sport, maybe a different value. Right now we're really promoting medals and high performance, but this idea of it, the other values it offers: community, connection, belonging, leadership, a sense of confidence, identity, all these other values. People are raving about that in the chat as well. Cool. Other last words? We've got about a few minutes left. Stephanie, or Carolyn? Go ahead, Carolyn, and then we'll finish off with Steph.
Stable. I've been booted off a few times. I think I'm impatient, and we talk. We can do more listening. We can hear, and we can wait for someone else to make the decision. But probably everybody in their own way can just do something. And people call me crazy and unstable, but you know, once you step in and start, if you just got to start, do something. You know, if it's the rung on the ladder, help someone get to the ladder, help them with that first step. But if we wait for someone else, some other organization to do, we'll be waiting a long time and it'll never change. So I'm sure everyone on this session wants to do something, but what? Just do something, you know, something. Connect out to somebody you wouldn't normally speak to, work with, and say, what can we do together on this? And what I would say is you'll learn a lot. Gololcha, as I said, and there are many others in the ethnocultural community who said things to me, they go, I wonder if anyone else has heard this comment about trust, about sense of belonging, all of these things. But instead of sort of going, reflecting and reflecting and reflecting, and then we forget about it because we're all so busy, just do something. So that's my message.
And so many directions were provided today. I could,
Yeah.
you know, I know I hooked onto a couple. I thought I can do that. I can do this. I can send it here. So I'm sure everybody is making those connections. Great point. Thank you, Carolyn and Steph.
Well, first of all, just a big thank you. It has been an honor to get to know and to hear your thoughts to the rest of the panelists. And thank you to Jen for putting this on and for all the thoughtful comments. It's so awesome to watch the chat go by and everyone is so engaged, and I'm taking a lot away from this. And my final comment is this was said to me from a friend who's an inclusion and accessibility consultant in Vancouver, Karen Lay. And it really started to get me shifting the way I was thinking. And her thought was, you know, if we really have community as a Canadian value, and because, you know, if we look at a lot of things in sport, it can appear to be very individualistic, focusing on medals, wanting to be the best, wanting to keep, you know, your program, your strategy to yourself, exclusion. And if we really are to be community-based and to really promote diversity and inclusion, then we need to rethink the way we look at help, or, you know, people need help and we look at it as a negative thing. And she posed to me that if we really are going to get everybody involved and really act as a community, we have to help each other. And we need to reach out, recognize who's not here, build bridges, and it takes time and energy. And it can be hard in sport because, you know, we want to be so focused and driven, but I think we're going to actually have a lot more energy and we'll see our own performances and pathways be enhanced if we help out the people around us. And, you know, what's the saying that the tide floats all boats, a rising tide brings up all boats or something. And I think we have to help each other more. And it's looked at such a negative thing. Asking for help. You know, we've seen it in the media recently. You know, we've had a number of our national team rugby women call out and ask for help. And the headline yesterday was, well, that makes them look like victims. And I was just so appalled. I was so appalled by that notion that asking for help is a negative thing or it makes you look like a victim. Because there's no way we are going to have more people participating in sport and more people thriving unless we start helping each other. So, you know, for me as a leader in sport, trying to, you know, as Marnie said, who's not here? Let's pull them in and figure out how to build more bridges.
Bingo. Love it. I love all of you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really, so many comments about how brilliant you all are. And if you didn't catch that, and really great to see you. Lovely to hear your thoughts. So insightful, helpful. I'm sure people feel a real equipped, you know, to do something and connect with, and love this last call to rethinking what it means to help one another. I mean, that really is the basis of community, isn't it? Yeah, and sport teaches us that we need our teammates, don't we? Great dialogue. Final comments. All right, and take care, all. I will just quickly put up some of the contact information if people want to follow up, just so it's in the recording as well. And people can, of course, watch this later or share it along their networks and channels. And thank you so much for spending that hour with us, an hour and a half, actually. Pleasure to see everybody. And our next one will be on June 2nd. We're going to welcome a number of guests Well, I'm just nailing those down. I have quite a few, so I have to sometimes do individual interviews. But partnering with Andrea Carey, who runs Inclusion Incorporated, and we'll have a part 2 to this one. There were so many people who wanted to participate that I thought, well, we can do a double like we did with gender equity. And then I think we're going to finish off and take a little break, or we'll see. Maybe we'll carry on for infinity, but the one after that will be maybe a bit later. We'll take the summer off and kick off one on sport as education. Lots of great guests waiting and chomping at the bit to participate in that one. All right, and thanks again, all. Big hugs to all of you and great work. Everyone's doing such fantastic work in their various realms. Power to you. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. That was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.